In this video, we're going to talk about the control of urine formation. The formation of urine is altered by these chemical messengers called hormones, and these hormones are released from endocrine glands throughout the body. And there are a couple of different reasons why the amount of urine being produced needs to be controlled. So first of all, remember that part of the reason why we have to produce urine is to help to keep the tonicity of our body fluids isotonic to our cells. So that's why when you drink a lot of water, you tend to urinate more. And that's because you have plenty of water in your body to help with that isotonicity, and the excess water just gets removed from your body in the form of urine. If you're dehydrated, your kidneys will actually reabsorb or hold on to more water in order to try to maintain that isotonicity with your body cells. Osmoregulation also influences blood pressure. And let's talk about kind of how these two components go hand in hand. So remember we talked about how the formation of urine is kind of this tug of war between the renal tubule, and anything in the renal tubule is going to leave the body as urine, and the blood. And so anything that's in the peritubular capillaries or anywhere in the blood is going to stay in the body. So if blood pressure gets too low, the urinary system will increase the amount of water that is reabsorbed. Remember that reabsorption happens when the water gets filtered or pushed from the blood into the renal tubule, but during that reabsorption stage of urine formation, the water gets reabsorbed or reclaimed back into the bloodstream. So the water leaves the renal tubule and goes back into the blood where it's going to stay in the body. So by increasing water reabsorption, this is also going to cause the volume of the blood to increase. Because now there's more water in the blood. And the more volume there is, then the more pressure there is. So when blood volume increases, blood pressure also increases. And if you are reabsorbing more water, then the volume or the amount of urine that is being excreted is going to decrease, because instead of that water leaving the body in the form of urine, it's getting pulled back into the blood to stay in the body. Now, the opposite is also true. So if blood pressure increases, water reabsorption in the kidneys is going to decrease, which is going to decrease blood volume and decrease blood pressure and increase the amount of urine that is produced. And the amount of water reabsorption is controlled in the nephrons, and it is controlled by hormones. So here's a list of the hormones that are involved in osmoregulation and maintaining a homeostatic blood pressure. There's atrial natriuretic peptide, also known as ANP, antidiuretic hormone, also known as ADH, and it's also known as vasopressin. Aldosterone, something called the renin-angiotensin system, and then epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are also known as adrenaline and noradrenaline. And out of all of these, the atrial natriuretic peptide is going to decrease blood pressure, but it is the only hormone involved in doing so. The rest of these are all involved in increasing blood pressure. And we'll talk more specifically how these hormones cause this effect on the following slides. So we'll start with the odd one out. So the atrial natriuretic peptide is the only one that is ultimately going to decrease blood pressure. It is produced and secreted by the heart. So if we look at atrial, that should make you think of atrium. And it has a couple of different systematic effects on the body. So first of all, it is a vasodilator, which means that it affects the smooth muscle in the walls of blood vessels, and it causes the blood vessels to dilate. In doing so, there is less resistance to the blood moving through the blood vessels, and so blood pressure decreases. So imagine if you had a hose and you've got it kind of pinched off and you've got a lot of pressure coming out of that hose, but then when you release the kink and you open up the diameter of the hose, the same amount of liquid is moving through that hose, but it's doing so at a lower pressure. ANP also has a diuretic effect, which means that it prevents sodium reabsorption. Remember, it's preventing this from happening in that renal tubule. And if you decrease sodium reabsorption, you also decrease water reabsorption. Because remember, water follows salt. So if there's less salt, there's also going to be less water moving out of the renal tubule and back into the bloodstream. So atrial natriuretic peptide increases water excretion, which means that it increases urine volume. So we're getting rid of more water, which is going to decrease the blood volume, which is going to decrease the blood pressure. ANP also works to suppress the other hormones which are involved in increasing blood pressure. The next hormone is antidiuretic hormone, also abbreviated as ADH, and also known as vasopressin. And ADH has a couple of different effects on the body in order to increase blood pressure. So first of all, it's involved in systemic vasoconstriction, and this is the opposite of what ANP does, where it causes the smooth muscle in the blood vessel walls contracts to decrease the diameter of the blood vessel. So this is like pinching off a hose. So as water is moving through a hose, if you pinch off part of it, it makes the water come out or move through with a higher pressure. And the alternative name of vasopressin kind of tells you that. So that vasopressin tells you that it's involved in vasoconstriction. ADH is created by the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus is up here in the brain. And the hypothalamus is actually connected directly to part of the pituitary gland. So it is created in the hypothalamus, but then it is released or secreted through the pituitary glands. In addition to the vasoconstriction, it also inserts aquaporins or causes more aquaporins to be inserted into the collecting ducts. And remember, the collecting ducts are part of that renal tubule. And remember that aquaporins are just these transport proteins that allow water to cross cell membranes faster. So if you have more aquaporins, you're going to have more water reabsorption. So this is water being reabsorbed from the renal tubule and put back into the blood. This is going to increase blood volume, which increases blood pressure, and it decreases urine output. One kind of interesting side note about ADH is that when you consume alcohol, it actually inhibits the release of ADH. And so that's why if you're drinking alcohol, you typically have to urinate more often. And it actually contributes to the symptoms of a hangover because part of having a hangover is being dehydrated. And so it doesn't really matter how much water you drink if you don't have the ADH being produced at the level it's supposed to, that water is just going to move right through you, and it's not really going to help your hangover symptoms. Aldosterone is another hormone that helps to increase blood pressure. It is produced by the adrenal glands, and you have two adrenal glands, one superior to each kidney. So you can see in this picture here, this is the kidney. And then you've got the adrenal glands located superior or just above the kidneys. Aldosterone works by increasing sodium reabsorption. So remember, reabsorption, you're taking that sodium from the renal tubule and putting it back into the blood. Now remember that adage that water follows salt. So if you increase sodium reabsorption, that is going to also increase water reabsorption. So those two go hand in hand. With more water being reabsorbed into the blood volume increases, which increases the blood pressure, and it decreases the amount of urine or the volume of urine that is produced. Aldosterone is also part of something called the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. So the key components of this system, the first one is angiotensinogen, and this is made in the liver. And angiotensinogen gets converted into angiotensin 1. And this reaction is catalyzed by an enzyme known as renin. So the enzyme gets written above the arrow. And renin is secreted by the kidney. Angiotensin 1 then gets converted to angiotensin 2. And that reaction is catalyzed by an enzyme known as angiotensin converting enzyme, or ACE. And interestingly, it is actually produced in the lungs. And then angiotensin 2 is the actual molecule that then affects the production of urine. So angiotensin 2 increases water retention, and by retention we mean that reabsorption. So it increases reabsorption of water. And it does so by decreasing the glomerular filtration rate, which is that GFR that we talked about in another video. By increasing water reabsorption, this increases blood volume, which increases blood pressure, which decreases the volume of urine being produced. It also works like ADH in that it causes systemic vasoconstriction. So systemic just means that it's affecting all of the blood vessels in the body and not just certain blood vessels in certain areas. So by decreasing the diameter of the blood vessels, that also helps to increase blood pressure. And then angiotensin 2 also stimulates the release of aldosterone and antidiuretic hormone, both of which also help to increase water reabsorption, increasing blood volume, increasing blood pressure, and decreasing the volume of urine produced and excreted from the body. This picture kind of puts that renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system all together. So you can see here we have our angiotensinogen, which is produced by the liver. And it gets converted to angiotensin by renin, which is produced by the kidneys. Angiotensin 1 gets converted to angiotensin 2 by angiotensin converting enzyme, which is produced by the liver. And then angiotensin 2 has direct effects on the kidneys, but it also activates aldosterone and ADH, which also act upon the kidneys to increase blood pressure. And then we have our kind of odd man out, our ANP, and this is the one that decreases blood pressure. And last but not least, we also have epinephrine and norepinephrine. And these chemicals are interesting because they act as both neurotransmitters and hormones. So epinephrine is secreted by the adrenal glands. Remember, the adrenal glands are those glands that are just above each kidney. And then norepinephrine is produced by the nervous system. And these hormones are known to be associated with the sympathetic nervous system, which remember is the fight or flight response. So epinephrine and norepinephrine, also known as adrenaline and noradrenaline, are going to help to direct resources towards the body structures that are needed in order to either fight a threat or flee or run away from a threat. And so when you're in a situation, let's say you've got a bear chasing you, you don't really need your kidneys to be producing urine at that point. You need to be running away from the bear. So all of your resources need to be going to your skeletal muscle and your diaphragm so that you can breathe heavier, and your heart so that it pumps faster, so that your body is taking in oxygen and distributing it to your cells so that they can make ATP. So when you're in fight or flight mode, your kidney function is less important at that time. So these actually have a somewhat inhibitory effect on the kidneys. So kidney function actually decreases in this stressful situation. And this leads to vasoconstriction of the afferent arteriole. And remember that this is the blood vessel that leads into the glomerulus. So if you decrease the amount of blood going into the glomerulus, you're going to decrease filtration rate. Which is ultimately also going to decrease the amount of urine being produced. These hormones also act to stimulate the renin angiotensin aldosterone system that we talked about on the previous slides, which also technically should have ADH in there because it's also increasing ADH.